Hi, so my name's Andrew Dudley and welcome to Earth Live, a brand new webcast featuring interviews with those people working on the front lines of conservation. Today we're joined by Glenn Hurowitz of Mighty Earth in Washington, DC. Glenn, welcome to Earth.
Thanks so much. Congratulations on the new show.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you. Could you describe what you do at Mighty Earth, please?
Sure. Mighty Earth is a global advocacy organization, and we work on the big issues like protecting tropical rainforests, solving climate change, and protecting oceans. And we try to work in some of the gaps that are not being sufficiently addressed. So that's one of the things that's brought us to nature-based solutions to climate change, for instance, which is 1/3 of the solution to climate, and yet gets only 1.5% of the funding dedicated to climate. And so we see this as an area where there's a real need and where we can make a contribution.
Okay, and what age did you realize that you were going to devote your career to this?
Well, at some level, probably age 10, because that was when global warming first hit the headlines, and it really freaked me out. I think I've always had an intrinsic love of animals, wildlife, nature, but the fact that the planet faced this existential threat, even when I was a little kid, I saw it and got really worried. I was like a little Greta Thunberg, but without anything like the megaphone, just a deep concern. And I would even, go around picking up cans to recycle them. And I remember when I was playing tennis when I was a kid, and I suddenly started thinking about global warming, and I couldn't keep my focus on the match. And I'd been up 4-1 in a set, and then suddenly fell apart and lost it. I fixed that issue, and learned to deal with the, with the great looming threat that we have around this. But it is something quite deep.
You recently wrote an article for Yale Environment 360, which was really interesting, and we're going to publish a link to it at the bottom of this interview. But can you tell us a little bit more about that? You spoke about the connection between the clearing of lands and the introduction of diseases to humans.
Yeah, well, on that front, scientists say that the number one cause of pandemics, like coronavirus, is deforestation and destruction of native ecosystems. And associated wildlife trafficking. We are humans, when they clear these lands, they get into contact with animals that harbor diseases that we've never encountered. And whether it's through bushmeat or poaching, that causes those areas to come in. And it's typically corporations, big agribusiness, that is driving that expansion in the first place, and then others may come along and do illegal hunting or what have you. And so as deforestation has continued at a pace of 30 million acres a year, that is a lot of new land and new animals that people are coming into contact for the first time. It's accentuated by concentration of livestock in industrial agriculture operations, as well as, weak and corrupt governance in some places. And so we are calling for pandemic prevention to focus significantly, not just on wearing masks and social distancing, but on a massive scale up of investment in tropical rainforest conservation in particular. So we want to see trees worth more alive than dead. There should be large scale financing. Second, countries, United States, UK, Europe, and elsewhere, should prohibit the import of goods that are linked to deforestation and should not allow companies that are driving deforestation to do business in their company. That is just financing more pandemics. Mm-hmm. And just to ground this a little bit, this is not just coronavirus. AIDS and Ebola both came from, have their roots in tropical deforestation. And those have caused huge damage as well. But this is likely to be, this is not likely to be the last pandemic unless we take significant action commensurate with the problem. The world is spending trillions of dollars to address this pandemic. A fraction of that money, billions of dollars, could end deforestation globally. And we should not forget that is the single most important thing we can do to prevent future pandemics. So if we don't want to have this recurring every few years, that is the number one step we need to do. And we need to communicate to policymakers that it's not just a thing right in front of your face. Like, frankly, only addressing the problems right in front of our faces is a huge part of what got us into this mess.
Yeah. And so you also say in the article that, companies know now that, few customers want to buy a bar of soap or bite into a cookie that's linked to deforestation or destruction of orangutan's home or indigenous lands. Do you think there's a huge disconnect between what people are aware of and what's actually happening on the ground?
Well, it's interesting. I think we've seen huge progress in part driven by consumer concern. So palm oil is a great example of this. Palm oil is rightly notorious. It's driven the destruction of over 30,000 square miles of the paradise forest of Southeast Asia. And that is an amazing place, and it's this carbon-rich territory. And what has happened is, we and other organizations have publicized that. And as a result, there has been an upwelling of concern, and that has been focused on some of the end consumers of palm oil, companies that make soap, shampoo, cookies, chocolates, detergent. And as a result, they and financiers have put pressure on the world's largest palm oil companies to change. I played a role in getting Wilmar, Asia's largest agribusiness, to adopt a no deforestation policy back in 2013. And what we saw since then is that 90% of the industry within a year after that happened adopted very strong forest and human rights policies. With a lot of work on enforcement, we have, and our partners have succeeded in reducing deforestation in the palm oil industry from 1 million acres a year to less than 250,000 in each of the last 3 years. Now, that's 250,000 too many. We have a lot of work still to do, and there's still a lot of challenges. But this is a gigaton scale climate success, and there are many tree kangaroos and orangutans and Sumatran tigers that are still alive because of this. And there are many indigenous communities who still have their homes because of this revolution that's been mostly driven by the private sector. And so that our ability to help drive that change was ultimately driven by the fact that consumers would act on that kind of concern in their purchasing or in showing up to protest or taking action otherwise. And it is a success that we shouldn't forget, because deforestation in other areas where we haven't seen that kind of pressure has, notably the meat industry, has been really high. In recent years, we've been able to help spread that success from the palm oil industry to the rubber industry and to the cocoa industry in West Africa. And we're finally starting to see some results there where companies are enforcing policies. There's a lot more to do, but we also recently saw the deforestation in West Africa declining by 1/2, which is a significant win. We need to do a lot to lock it in, but this model works, and I think consumers and others can be really proud of it.
Okay, thank you. And so if we look back through the last couple of decades, there's been the kind of corporate social responsibility. You've got the ESGs as well, environmental, social, and corporate governance. How is this different? I mean, companies now are responding to external pressure. Do you think that's the key to this?
Yeah, absolutely. That is the number one driver, is responding to individual citizens getting involved and being loud and noisy about the fact that, as you say, they don't want to buy a bar of soap that's made from killing orangutans, or bite into a hamburger that's linked to the burning of the Amazon. And that's a very powerful force. I think one of the things that's different is consumers want to know where their food comes from and that it's produced in a manner consistent with their values. Equally, people who work at companies, historically, I think mostly saw it as a job, as an income. And now people really want to bring their conscience to work with them, even if they're not, working in an explicitly public interest organization. They want to, even if they're going to work at a big agribusiness, have the feeling that they're doing something meaningful and positive in the world. And when either customers or employees speak up, this is a big deal for companies. They're in a competition for good staff, for talented staff, and they're also in a competition, of course, for people's wallets. And so this has become a really powerful trend. You mentioned ESGs, and I think those have been helpful, those metrics, but too often they're just very vague, and the standard, they're doing indices for thousands of companies. It's hard to have a real assessment of whether the standards are high enough or whether the impact is strong enough. And so that's why I think this more granular approach that really allows people to speak up and set a new standard in the industry. Once that happens, once you have a single company take a leadership role, if the others continue to be pushed, very often, you set a new standard and it just becomes the expectation that there won't be deforestation, there won't be pollution, there won't be land grabbing in that supply chain.
And do you feel that, looking back 20 years ago when the Harkin-Engle Protocol was pulled together for the chocolate industry, do you think that there's a role the government should play where there should be legislation around enforcing these changes, or should it be voluntary for corporations?
Absolutely, and I think we totally need government to play a massive role, and in many ways the private sector action is plan B. In many places, governments are just not doing, including the United States, are not doing their job to protect the environment. But just because they're not doing the job doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done. And that's why we think the private sector is paradoxically positioned to drive conservation progress in places where government is either unwilling or unable to do so. There is a contradiction or a paradox in the sense that some of the very companies responsible for this environmental destruction that we've witnessed are actually best positioned to help solve it. And that observation, I think, has allowed us to help drive large-scale change by the private sector. But in terms of the government role, governments should provide large-scale financing to incentivize forest conservation and restoration. They need to bar the import of goods associated with deforestation. And they need to crack down on things like illegal logging. We have something called the Lacey Act here in the United States. And if there's import of illegally logged timber or paper, that is illegal, and companies can be prosecuted over that. And so we need to spread that, fully enforce it here in the United States, but also spread it to other countries.
Okay, thank you. And so we're speaking with your colleague Etel next week on the dark side of chocolate, the documentary that was recently featured in Netflix. What do you think the response has been to that? What have you guys seen from the chocolate industry?
So the chocolate industry, in great measure due to Etel's amazing work and rallying a movement very quickly, adopted very strong forest and human rights policies a few years ago. They said they would stop sourcing from national parks and protected areas where they were getting up to 40% of their cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire, which is the world's largest cocoa producing country, and have had for many decades labor force that gets paid less than $1 a day. And so we were really excited about those commitments and the fact that they happened so fast. It showed that the no deforestation revolution was spreading. What has been frustrating is that when you look at major cocoa companies like Cargill in particular, but also customers, Nestle, Mars, etc., there was not sufficient implementation of those commitments. And so both we, in our investigations and analysis, and also a French TV station, Swiss TV station, independently went to Cote d'Ivoire to look at how these companies were implementing their commitments. They found Cargill continuing to drive deforestation in national parks. And when we took a step back and just analyzed what's happening to the national parks and protected areas of West Africa, historically home to amazing animals like forest elephants and chimpanzees, we found that nothing had changed. Illegal deforestation, child labor was still continuing. We've tried to put pressure on the chocolate companies, on Cargill, to change. I think that's starting to have some impact, and they are starting to implement. And that's a big reason why deforestation in West Africa went down 50% last year. We need to lock in those gains. The governments need to do more. Donors need to do more. But ultimately, chocolate companies should not be selling treats to children that come from destroying chimpanzee habitat or having refugee children in horrible circumstances. And that is, a huge moral challenge to companies, to governments, the people behind the sort of large-scale destruction that has happened for chocolate in West Africa.
In your article, you also speak about meat, meat industry. So, you're on one side, you've got you guys doing the incredible work, putting the pressure on the companies. So what can the consumers do as well? What can they do to support your efforts?
So meat is really interesting. I talked about a lot of the successes that we've seen in palm oil, deforestation plummeting, cocoa for the first year going down 50%. In rubber, we've set up infrastructure so that we never again see a surge in deforestation and land grabbing, we hope. But the meat industry has really resisted taking those kinds of same steps. And there haven't been sufficient campaigns on meat. We're trying to ramp it up, but and that's I hope people will get involved. And if you're interested in doing so, you can go to our website, which is mightyearth.org, to take action, to call in supermarkets like Stop and Shop, Food Lion, Costco, to stop doing business with the biggest deforesters like Cargill, like JBS, the cattle giant. And this is the reality, that despite the fact that we know that there are 1.6 billion acres of degraded land in Latin America alone, and many more in other parts of the world, where you can expand agriculture without threatening native ecosystems, we see big ag companies like Cargill, like JBS, continue to drive the bulldozing and burning of the Amazon and other ecosystems. This is a crime. This is we call it an ecocide. And it's also often a genocide in the sense that you have these indigenous groups that are relying on this land and being pushed out by ranchers and soy plantation owners raising soy for animal feed, ultimately to be made into chicken, pork, beef that is being sold to consumers around the world. It's being sold in supermarkets in Europe, Casino, Carrefour, Ahold Delhaize, and in the United States, Costco does business with JBS and Cargill. And all of these supermarkets and other consumers of meat have politely pulled on the sleeves of the Cargills and JBS of the world. They've said, please stop deforestation, please stop land grabbing. And then nothing happens, and then they do it again, and then they have a big meeting and they talk about how much they care about Mother Earth and how they want it and how terrible it is and how much they're doing by calling for action. Well, they've called for action for years, and Cargill and JBS especially, but there's other meat companies too, but these two are the largest and the leaders, have ignored their pleas. And Cargill's number 2 told me that they had essentially contempt for their customers because these customers were calling on them to take action. But unlike in palm oil or cocoa, these supermarkets that I've mentioned, like Costco, like Ahold Delhaize, have not taken commercial action. They haven't shown any evidence to us that they have said to Cargill, okay, you are defying us openly. You're continuing to drive deforestation. You're knowingly purchasing animal feed from a company that we have satellite pictures of driving deforestation on a vast scale that's linked to the burning of the Amazon that's in our headlines. And they need to take this seriously and take commercial sanction. The time for polite letters is long over. The climate is in crisis. And if I might say, I think there's something that happened just in the last week that's really interesting and is a potential revolution in corporate accountability. In Australia, Rio Tinto, one of the world's largest mining companies, as part of its mining operations, destroyed a Aboriginal Australian sacred site. And that's really bad. The reality is that's like a day at the office for the CEO of Cargill, David McLennan, or for JBS. They are on a daily or weekly basis very frequently driving negative impacts for Indigenous people, including displacement of wholesale communities. And yet there's no accountability for them, either from their boards or from their customers or from their financiers. And with Rio Tinto, what happened was over a single site that I don't think any people were immediately negatively affected, the CEO was fired or is leaving his job because of that, because investors especially demanded it. And I was shocked to see that. I was excited to see it because it's real accountability. We don't usually go around calling for scalps of CEOs. We're trying to drive transformation, not just get people fired. But, I look at Cargill, I look at JBS, for years and years, they've been called out for their environmental and human rights crimes. Their customers pressure them, their investors pressure them, and there hasn't been action. So it is time for that kind of accountability.
So you mentioned, briefly touched upon Ecocide. So 12 countries have enacted that as national legislation as we stand today. But the UN has not ratified it as an international crime. Yeah. Is that something that you would like to see pushed forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even more importantly is for other national level countries to take environmental crimes in general, and of course something as vast as the kind of ecocide we're seeing in the Amazon and other ecosystems in South America seriously. There should be criminal accountability if you are destroying nature on a vast scale. If you're, driving a species to extinction, this is murder, and we should know it. And it's not just murder of wildlife or even just the indigenous people who, homes you may be directly destroying. Those fires that we're seeing in the Amazon, they kill people. In Southeast Asia, we worked with scientists who found that the haze in 2015 cut short the lives of 100,000 people in just one fire season. It's likely that the Amazon fires from last year and the ones that are continuing this year are having at least as great an impact. So this is, and there's a even more impact. That burning of the rainforest and other ecosystems makes the climate hotter through releasing all of that pollution. And that in turn makes the likelihood of fire and floods elsewhere that kill people greater. The fires that we've been seeing in California and Oregon on the West Coast are directly linked to the burning of the Amazon and pollution from other sources.
Exactly. And just in closing, for a young person or someone looking for a career change, what advice would you give them if they were looking at, getting involved like you are in conservation?
Sure. Well, let me speak to that directly. I think the great thing about a career in conservation or doing any kind of work for conservation, it's the one chance that humans have to really touch the eternal. If you can contribute to ensuring that an endangered species survives into the next century, for millennia, for millions of years, it's the kind of impact that you cannot even imagine in any other field of human endeavor. If you can keep our planet healthier, that is an extraordinary achievement. If you can keep your community healthier and alive and prevent killing and burning, this is the kind of achievement I think that's really only possible in conservation and the environmental movement. And it's, a huge part of what motivates me. I think it's also worth saying, don't worry about saving the whole planet. That's an impossible task for any individual. Think about how you can contribute to saving a forest, saving a species, saving an individual animal or population of wildlife. And it could be in your backyard, or maybe it's even somewhere far away where you have leverage through being a customer, being a financier, ultimately being an activist or organizer to do that. And that, I think, and what you can do if you have even a small victory, not only will it have a powerful direct impact to keep an area intact for millennia, millions of years, hopefully, but it can also inspire others to take action. And maybe that all together actually can make a contribution towards saving the planet and, addressing the sort of existential dread that so many people feel. I think it is, if you were trying to take on the whole planet, it is hard to, feel anything other than dread. But I find that if I'm actually getting my hands dirty with a campaign, with some other kind of conservation action, it at least gives me, lets me feel that I'm doing my best. And making it, and often you see results because these messages are so powerful. And they even have a moral appeal to cynical executives who may have spent their whole career bulldozing the rainforest, but have some conscience pulling on them. Or maybe it's their son or daughter or sister, brother's conscience saying, Dad, why are you doing this? Why are you spending your career bulldozing some of the last remaining wilderness? Why are you operating a coal plant? And that to me is the argument I would make for people to go into conservation as an activist, as a volunteer, or even as a career. I will also add to that concretely, if you're interested in a job in the conservation movement, and for a young person especially, there's an organization called Green Corps that does year-long fellowships and is a great way to learn the skills and how to run and win environmental campaigns. I did it a long time ago, and those campaigns that I did at a small scale initially, and the skills I learned, I just apply it as kind of a global scale now. And so I couldn't recommend it enough. There's a lot of other great programs and organizations out there also. And honestly, if you care, no matter what you get into or don't get into, in your own time, find an environmental campaign, find some other way to contribute to conservation, And things will work out if you're consistent with it. And I think ultimately you can land up with a career in conservation and having that kind of lifelong impact.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And do you have a book to recommend for people to read that's been really inspiring for you?
Sure. Well, I knew you were going to ask this question, and so I thought about it on a completely different plane. I would say one of the things that I find informs my work from a strategic perspective is classical military strategy. So I read a great biography of Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, who in many ways had like great brutality that he caused in his life, and in Haiti and a lot of cruelty and war. He also, changed Europe in a lot of different ways. But what I found really powerful was the strategic lessons that I think you can apply to environmental and other social change work. And I've done a lot of work in the sort of progressive social change theory area as well. But I was fascinated to find in that book and others lessons like concentration of force that we really do try to apply in campaigns. And so I'll give you, there's another great book called This is an Uprising that's much more about social change theory and, the kind of nonviolent action that has inspired me and continues to inspire me through my whole career, taking lessons from Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and this book, This is an Uprising, distills that. And so it's a good complement, but it's interesting to see these principles applied, not just in movement building, but also in other fields, and they have been for millennia.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll be sure to check those books out. We'll also include a link to the organisation you mentioned as well at the bottom also. So Glenn, well, thank you for doing what you do. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you today. And if it's okay with you, we'd like to check back at some point in the future if you've got any other things going on that we could cover for you guys. We'd be really honoured to do that.
I'd love to do so.
Okay, take care, Glenn.
Thanks so much. Okay, take care.